Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us. That was so powerful. How amazing was that film? I'm Dr. Patricia Ward, Director of Science Exhibitions and Partnerships at the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago, and I'm very happy to be here this evening with James Balog, the driving force behind this truly exceptional film we just watched, The Human Element. So before we start taking some audience questions, I'd like to take just a moment to introduce James, artist, scientist, and passionate advocate for the environment and for our future. James is the founder and director of the Earth Vision Institute, a nonprofit organization based in Boulder, Colorado, with the mission of integrating art and science to reveal environmental change and inspire a balanced relationship with nature. James's very impressive body of work goes back decades. And in addition to the Human Element film, he was the producer of Chasing Ice, the award-winning film that documented the largest glacier calving event ever witnessed. His work has been featured in more than 100 exhibitions in museums and galleries worldwide, including the Extreme Ice exhibition at the Museum of Science and Industry. He has published his work in 8 books, as well as in a number of major magazines, including National Geographic and Time Magazine. James was also a US NASA representative at the World Climate Summit in Paris and has spoken at numerous conferences and events around the world. Welcome, James. It's a real privilege to have you with us here this evening.
Yep. Hello, Patty. It's a pleasure. I'm glad to have this opportunity. I really appreciate the museum making the screening possible. And I'm thrilled to pieces to discover how many people are online watching this virtual event. You know, when this crazy COVID thing started, I don't think anybody knew that we would get any more than 20 people online for these kinds of screenings, and here we have thousands. So that's really exciting and gratifying. So we're all gathering around this new form of communal fireplace to engage with each other and engage with our feelings about the world.
Indeed we are. And the Human Element film is just such an appropriate part of us celebrating the 50th anniversary of Earth Day. We're just thrilled to have it because to me, it just so beautifully balances both the urgency of the environmental crisis, but also with a sense of hope and a sense of optimism. And you talked a little bit at the beginning of the film about what drove you in your career. And I'm wondering what inspired you to make this film?
Yeah, well, I kind of tiptoed into it with a certain amount of trepidation because I realized that, you know, my main art form was still photography, and that's what I had 40 years of practice in. And I wasn't so sure that this was the right creative project for me to work on, but I had this thing burning in my head about the trying to conceptually and visually integrate earth, air, fire, and water, these basic fundamental physical elements, and I wanted to bring that to life. And it seemed to me that cinema was the best way to do that. At the same time, I had this notion about humanity being a fifth element, being a force of human tectonics. That had been growing in me for a number of years. And in fact, I had written some chapters in a book I've been trying to get finished about that subject. So anyway, it all came together and here it was.
Wonderful, thank you. Yeah. And I want to say thank you to everyone who submitted questions for James before the event and while the movie was playing in the YouTube chat. And we do have some really great questions for you, James, from our audience. I want to jump right to those if that's okay.
Yeah, go to it.
So our first question is from James Safia, who asked, right to the point, how cool was it to do all of this?
You know, one of the great joys of this profession, and I've been doing this for how many years now, 40, 41, 42 years. One of the great joys of this profession is that you get to see so many unbelievable things. You get to meet so many incredible people in different walks of life and see so many different landscapes. And the secret sauce in so much of this is that people are eager to tell their stories. You know, I've been asked over and over again, how seemingly unsettling or upsetting a situation might be, people want to tell their story. So they're flattered and honored that some stranger comes out of nowhere and wants to spend time with them. So I get to experience all that, and I get to see all these amazing places. So it's great fun.
Well, one of the things that really stands out to me is that you're right in it. You're in the thick of it. You're in the thick of people's stories. You're in the thick of the storms, the fire, the floods. What were some of your most compelling moments or your most frightening moments? Those fires looked a little scary.
Yeah, well, I'll answer. I'll kind of take a dogleg in a slightly different direction first, and I'll come back to that. You know, when I've worked with a lot of writers on different projects over the years, different magazine stories. And the one thing I learned early on, and you wind up with a certain amount of competition and tension between the writers and the photographers because of this, is that the writers can report on things. They can research things. They can talk over the telephones, whatever. A photographer has to be there. You can't do anything but be there. And again, that's the great joy and pleasure of this, but it's also, it takes a lot more time in the field than a writer typically spends on a project. And you actually have to put yourself at great risk quite often to do this work. So, you know, gosh, I've had so many unbelievable experiences in the course of, you know, just this film and the Chasing Ice project, but many other things with trees and avalanches and volcanoes and wildlife in Africa and extreme remote places in Greenland and Alaska and the Canadian Arctic and Antarctica. And, you know, it just goes on and on and on. People often ask me, what's the most beautiful place you've ever been? And yeah, they want to hear the exotic story. They want to hear about how fantastic Easter Island was. When I was down there to photograph Halley's Comet back in the mid 80s, and to be up there on the edge of that volcano at night, watching the stars and listening to the ocean down below me. I mean, that was really one of the great, what's the right word, metaphysical life experiences. But, you know, I also take incredible pleasure from what we have here in North America. We're blessed with a fantastic landscape in many different places. You know, I'm lucky to live in Boulder, Colorado, and within a, 6 or 8 hour drive of where I live are national parks and big mountains and incredible alpine scenery, but also gorgeous plains and gorgeous canyons. I mean, it's a great place, and you just have to keep your eyes open and appreciate what you have.
That's a great segue to the next question. So one of our audience members, Whit, would like to know, what's it like going day to day and seeing the real effects of climate change, and what kind of effect does that leave on you?
It's difficult, and I generally get kind of choked up and verklempt talking about this. So forgive me if I get a little weepy on this one, but it's fascinating in its way, and I am grateful that my career has taken me to a place where I feel such a strong urgency to look at these things and try to render them in some sort of imagery. At the same time, when you're out there in the field, you have to kind of put a lid on your emotions. You have to say, all right, I've got this job to do. I have to put this scene inside this rectangle, and that's what it all comes down to. It's inside that little black box, and you have to do that. And you have to put your emotions at bay. But then, when you back off and it's nighttime, or it's a month later, or it's a year later, or 10 years later, all that stuff piles up. See,
yeah,
there it goes. I'm getting choked up because it piles up, and it's with you all the time, and you realize how existentially overwhelming it is that you get to see this history changing in front of your eyes, and also how existentially overwhelming it is that you're seeing things disappear and go away that should not be disappearing and going away. And the real, two of the biggest emotional impacts on that for me have been, on the Glacier Project, realizing that these enormous features of the landscape. And look, I'm trained in that kind of science. I spent years and years studying it. And I've spent decades skiing and hiking across those kinds of big glaciers. And I always thought those things were there forever. And then you get into this kind of work and you get into this kind of photography and you realize it's not forever. It's a transitory phenomenon. And the other place that I think was the most impactful and revelatory for me was going to the aftermath of the big Indian Ocean tsunami, which was in December of 2004. And I got there in early 2005. And I got some of the scenes I saw, you just could not even comprehend in your wildest imagination what the damages and the chaos were like. I mean, it's really intense, and that always stays with me.
Well, your empathy for the people's stories and for the places and the emotion that you feel in your work clearly comes through and touches the viewers. I will say, if I'm a sample size of one.
Well, thank you. Yeah, you know, the one thing I'd like to mention in that context, and not lose it while we're talking about the people in these scenes, is in environmental films and environmental thinking in general, we can often be kind of high and mighty and on a pedestal. And environmental films have a way of kind of wagging their finger and pointing at the unconverted and all the foolish things that they're doing. And I find that counterproductive and probably unfair, because you know, we're in the biggest sense of all of these environmental issues. We're all in this together. We're all part of this gigantic system of cause and effect that creates these difficulties. So I acknowledge that I am just as much a part of these environmental problems as anybody else is, and I try and be empathetic with the people I've got to work with out in the field. But to me, that brings this tremendously encouraging corollary, which is, if we're all part of the problem, we can all be part of the solution. And I keep sight of that all the time.
Oh, that's great. Well, there's another question from our audience, from Zane, who would like to know who is your greatest inspiration in your work?
Whoa. There's really no one inspiration. I take inspiration from a lot of different directions. I take it from the sunrises and the sunsets and the moon at night. I take it from the incredible photographers, painters, sculptors, architects that have gone before me for thousands of years. You know, we don't know how to see things visually just because we cooked it up in the past, you know, month or years. We've learned how to see in the Western tradition for hundreds and thousands of years. And so I take great inspiration from all of that. I take great inspiration from the incredible filmmakers that have gone before us. So, you know, it all adds up for me. And I also, on a really regular basis, I take a lot of internal inspiration from music. You know, I just find that kind of gets my brain buzzing in a way that opens me to aesthetic things. And I like to read good literature. I don't read very much fiction, but I read a lot of well-crafted nonfiction. And I like that. And all these things to me fit together in this tapestry of sensibilities and thoughts and emotions that you have in your head. And it all somehow comes out in these different ways in the works when it's time. And you never know when something is going to trigger you and push you in a certain direction. And you may never, ever be consciously aware of it, but it's all there and it helps to feed the engine.
So James, several of our audience members have expressed interest in understanding things about tangible things that they can do. So I'll give you a couple of questions in that realm. So from Jake, who studied environmental studies in college, he would like to use his career, says, I would like to use my career to help spread the message about climate change and support sustainable energy. What advice do you have for someone interested in doing this kind of work?
I think the key thing is to recognize where your inherent skills, sensibilities, and interests lie. You know, for me to have become an engineer of wind turbines even though I would intellectually say, boy, I'd like to, change the energy generation system in the world, would be wrong. I'm not an engineer. I mean, I've done plenty of engineerish sorts of things, but I'm not quantitatively gifted enough with the math and the calculus and so on to become an engineer. So you have to take an honest look at yourself, follow your inner spirit, if that's how we can put it, and choose one thing to do. And that I think is the key, whether it's an educational path or it's what you do tomorrow morning. You have to focus on one thing and do the best you can with the tools you have and the opportunities you have, and move forward. And then when you start off in that direction, the other possibilities will open up. When it's a question of a career, for sure. When it's a question of, oh, the world's a big place, nothing's changing fast enough, what can I do? The answer is do it in your own home and pick one thing. And if all you do is change the damn light bulbs, do that, and then do something else. The information is all over the place. I'm not going to waste our time here tonight talking about changing light bulbs and putting solar panels on rooftops and having a more efficient car to drive. We all understand that stuff, but you do one thing and you do another thing and you keep on going.
That's great. So from Mark asks, what can I do as a 10-year-old to help save the planet?
Oh, the best thing you can do is bug your parents, man. You'd be amazed at what an influence children can have on their parents. And sometimes parents seem like they're floating up on this pedestal in the sky and they're these big, powerful people and they've got all the right answers. They don't have all the right answers. And your passion and your voice can help to redirect what they're doing and inspire them for your sake to do things better.
Oh, that's great. And Rory asks, do you think humans can reverse the impact that they have made on the earth?
No, we are, for better or for worse, we are part of the natural system. And we are not separate from nature. We are in and of nature. We are just as much an element of nature as fire is, and as water is, and as air is. And one of our big problems that we haven't recognized that as a matter, at least in the Western tradition, we haven't that. We have considered ourselves separate from nature. Nature has always been somewhere else over there, and people are somewhere else over here. But if you recognize that they're one and the same force, you also recognize that what you do to that non-human part of nature comes back to bite you, and it comes back and hurts us. So a different sensibility would make us smarter and make us create a more sensible world for a more sustainable world for ourselves and for our children. So we need a profound change of thinking, and we also need a profound change of incredibly pedestrian, tiny little things like changing light bulbs.
Great. And here's another question about change from Tommy, who asks, if humans don't make a change, how long does Earth have?
Earth will be here. We've got no problem with Earth being here. Earth is likely going to outlive Homo sapiens, the species. Some people ask the question of, will Homo sapiens destroy the living conditions for itself on the planet and drive itself out of existence? I don't think so. I think we're incredibly adaptable. I think we're smart enough to pull back from the brink. Above all, what this species wants is to survive. And I think that that's one of our greatest hopes and attributes, that we want to survive. We're not so stupid that we're going to self-destruct. So I think we have more or less an infinite amount of time. That's ultimately not infinite, because the species won't last for 500 million years. It'll only last for, I don't know what, 10 million years or 5 million years or something. But for all practical purposes in an individual human lifespan, that's infinite. So my friend, don't worry about whether or not we're going to come to the edge of the runway. We'll be around for a long time.
Actually, his question makes me think of another one I wanted to ask you, and that is what gives you hope? You kind of addressed it with your comment that we human beings, we want to survive. Um, what else gives you hope about our future?
You know, the really brilliant new generation that's coming along behind the generation that has so screwed things up, I'm amazed at how smart the younger people are. You know, whether it's somebody 10 years old, or it's a teenager, or it's somebody in their 20s, somebody in their 30s. There's a lot of fresh thinking going on, and a lot of fresh passion and energy. And you know, I will admit that at times I've thought, you know, I don't know what that 23-year-old is ranting and raving about. And then you stop and you listen to what people are saying, and you realize they're smart as hell. They got it figured out, you know. And it's 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 as much as anything, it's a matter of having a greater desire for planetary security than has been embedded in the previous generations, our generation, my parents' generation, the generations before that. The question of planetary security and climate stability, and those were not issues for those folks. And it's just, you know, it's now embedded in the thinking and the behavior and the concerns of younger people. I think it's a tremendous shape the world for good in the decades to come. At least I hope it will be a force for positive.
James Sharon would like to know how you celebrate Earth Day every year.
Well, in the recent decade, Earth Day for me seems to be doing these sorts of events and in helping expand the human mind and the human potential. That's my gift to the world. That to me is more important than anything I could do with planting a tree or daffodils or something outside. This is what I do. Actually, I've been doing it for longer than 10 years. Yeah, this goes back quite a while.
Wonderful. And our final audience question, Nina has asked a question that is certainly extremely relevant. She says, my family feels like we are somewhat aware about our purchases, our practices, and language to sometimes an annoying degree. What do you think are the most important or significant things anyone can do at home to reduce an individual's carbon footprint?
If it's really down to an individual level, probably one of the best things you can do is to try and eat a bit less meat. And it's a big thing to say, become a vegetarian. I would never say that to anybody, but it's easy enough for people to throttle back on their meat consumption. And if you do that, that reduces ultimately the amount of methane that your food generates is going to be less. So I think that's a really big thing. In a household that owns an automobile, the single most important thing you can do in the future is when there's a new car to be acquired, look for one that has a low carbon footprint. And that means either a hybrid car, a very high mileage car, or an electric car. And a lot of those choices are barely any more expensive than an ordinary gas guzzling vehicle. The way that you can learn, and let me mention, the single biggest impact that any individual has, generally speaking, is in their choice of transportation. 30% of your carbon footprint comes from transportation. So if you have a higher mileage car, a lower polluting car, that's really, really good. Where you get information on that is a website called driveclean.ca, as in California, .gov, driveclean.ca.gov. And they give you a listing of every car that's sold between coast to coast. And you get all the information on what the carbon footprint of these cars might be. And that's incredibly valuable information. And every time I have to get a new car, I spend hours and hours and days going through those lists, trying to identify the best possible place I can be. I don't always have the ability to have an electric car because A, I might not have the money, or B, I might need a car that has more storage capacity or has to drive a longer range. But I do the best I can to get a car with the lowest carbon footprint. Now, Patty, I'm amazed that nobody's asked yet about the connection between COVID and climate change. I mean, we're right smack in the middle of this COVID thing. I mean, that's
We are
a hot
indeed.
button issue in our brains. That's why we're here right now on the screen.
Mhm.
So can I say a couple of
Please.
words about
Yes, absolutely.
one of the big things that this crisis has taught us is that facts matter and science matters. I mean, that's really, really critical. You cannot take away the behavior of the physical and the chemical and the biological world by wishing it away or politicking it away or lobbying it away. It is what it is. The facts matter. That's what's driving the COVID situation. And the same issues drive the climate change question and the public reaction to the climate change question. We know from the science for many, many years, far, far, far longer than we know from the COVID or virus conditions, we know that science tells us that the facts are that the climate is changing because of dumping excess carbon into the atmosphere. We know that. We understand that. That is a fact. No president in any White House can make that go away any more than any president in a White House can make COVID go away. It's here. Both things are here. Climate change is here and COVID is here. So in shifting our minds in order to understand COVID better, we're learning how to think smarter and better about climate change when the time comes to think about that some more and deal with it more. Another big factor is that COVID is a fast-moving crisis. You know, it feels like an asteroid has just landed on all of us and exploded the world around us. And climate change is a slower-moving crisis, but it's going to be with us for a long time. Long after COVID's gone, we're going to be dealing with the impact of the climate change asteroid. And so we've got to, you know, step up to the problem and deal with it and accept it and work with it, because we cannot wish the physical reality of the climate system away. It is here. Another really big point, which I suspect many of you in Chicago have already heard, but in case you haven't, I'll mention it, is that the pollution in the air from industrial activity or intense car traffic on highways is a precondition for COVID. It damages the pulmonary system through long-term exposure. And people who live in those neighborhoods that are closer to those pollution sources have a higher rate of COVID, as well as pulmonary disease and asthma. African Americans who unfortunately tend to live in more in areas where the air is not as clean as it ought to be. African Americans have a 3 times greater rate of asthma than Caucasians do. That's a big deal. That's a social justice issue, and it's also a physical ecological issue. So all these things tie together, and so we've got to learn how to deal with looking at the facts, looking at the information, and making the right choices across a broad range of concerns and considerations, because those issues are there and they're not going away.
Yeah, indeed. James, I wonder what's next for you? You've done this impressive film, incredible body of work. We worked with you, great exhibition about extreme ice. What's in the pipeline for you?
Well, we've been working steadily and very, very energetically on an internationally traveling exhibition. It will get out the door sometime this fall, depending on when the museums open up again. But it's an exhibition of about 40 years of my work, looking at these various issues as humans and the rest of nature collide. And there's a big book that goes with that. We're in the process of designing that book. And the exhibition, as I say, will probably hit the streets in the late fall. The book won't be out for another year and a half or so. And then the exhibition will travel around the US to several locations, then go to Australia and Europe, and then back to the US. So, you know, that's all part of the outreach. That's all part of the vision. That's all part of telling the story of the Anthropocene and human tectonics. And, you know, that's my path. That's my mission. I don't feel any compelling need to do a new film anytime really soon, but there is a little thing clawing at me that there may be a sequel to Chasing Ice. And a couple of people in my circle, including Jeff Orlowski, who was the director of Chasing Ice 1, you know, he and I, you know, noodle on this over a beer every so often, and we start to talk ourselves into doing a sequel, and then we go, oh no, let's do something else for a while. So I don't know if that'll ever happen.
Well, we would certainly look forward to that. You know, James, we started this conversation with questions about what inspires you. And I just want to say that I think you're an incredible inspiration to all of us. And I'd like to thank you very much for being here with us tonight. And I'd like to thank everybody, all of our viewers who joined us to watch this incredible film and to hear from James Balog. Thank you, everybody. And let me wish you a good night and a happy Earth Day.